Welcome to a TBN special, The Rise of China. I'm Erick Stakelbeck here at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. Over the next hour, you'll hear why China's communist regime poses a unique threat to the United States and the world, from a massive military and nuclear arms buildup to cyber attacks against sensitive American targets. China is directly challenging the United States. Its goal is clear: to replace the U.S. as the world's next superpower. Despite this, and despite the Chinese government's continued evasiveness on the true origins of COVID-19, American companies are lining up to do business with Beijing. For some, the so-called social credit system that China uses to suppress and monitor its own citizens does not seem to affect their bottom line. But there is light in the darkness. While Christians in China suffer severe persecution, the church is growing by leaps and bounds in the world's most populous nation. We're joined today by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, courageous Chinese dissidents, and leading experts to get the inside story on the rise of China and why it matters to you. We are joined now at the Museum of the Bible with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Secretary, welcome. It's great to have you.
It is wonderful to be in this special place with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, and what a great view we have, a great backdrop, a place you know very well. And another thing you know about very well, Secretary, is the multiple adversaries on the world stage gathering against the United States. One of them is China. How does China pose a unique threat on multiple levels?
So the Chinese Communist Party presents far and away the greatest threat from outside of the United States to our continued existence as a republic. That sounds a little bit dramatic, but it's not a close call. They have a scale and a capability and an intention that is different from any other nation. And that is, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party that has an intention of global hegemony. That is, they want to take out all of us who believe in democracy, liberty, freedom, all the things that the West has stood for all these years. The Chinese want to stamp that out and have a very different model for the world. They are unique in the threat that they pose to the United States and to democracies around the world.
And building up militarily, of course, their nuclear arsenal growing. The ideology, you mentioned it's a communist regime. Tell us more about the ideology that drives this regime, and what can you tell us about the chairman, Xi Jinping?
That's actually a great place to start the conversation, because it is the ideology that drives this. It is deeply embedded in Xi Jinping's mind, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, in his mind, that China's rightful place in the world is as the Middle Kingdom. He talks about the China dream. This is the language he uses. The China dream is that each state will be a vassal state to this Chinese Communist Party empire. And so they believe with all the heart, right? They are atheists. They are communists. They believe they talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. Make no mistake, this is communism just like Karl Marx understood it. This is not original thought. They have a big economy, a powerful economic force around the world, and they are intent on using that and driving their ideology into places that are outside of their own country. I remind folks all the time, there are other countries that are communist. But what's unique here is that what happens in Beijing impacts everyone all around the world. It doesn't stay in Beijing. That is because there is intention to export their model around the world.
Yeah, we've seen, and they seem to be ascendant, Secretary, and growing more bold and more confident, including in their relations with the U.S. and the new administration. We've seen Chinese officials browbeat American officials in some face-to-face meetings recently. What's your take so far on the posture of the current administration towards the regime in Beijing?
So it's a little bit mixed, and it's a little early still. I certainly am praying that this administration gets it right. But my guess is they'll revert to, frankly, the Washington norm. So for 50 years, and this is bipartisan, the consensus was sell a few more trinkets, ship a few more jobs over, everything will be okay. This was the post-1972 model. Indeed, the model on which the Chinese Communists built its economic power was on the backs of the American worker. This administration has mouthed the right words, but I haven't seen them yet take the actions that are necessary. They're real actions that will confront the Chinese Communist Party, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, in the military space, in the economic space, to continue to build out the coalitions in the region, in the Pacific, that we need to protect and secure American freedom. I hope they get it right. This will be a long struggle for the United States to push back and confront the Chinese Communist Party. It's going to have to be a bipartisan effort. So I wish them well.
And Secretary, as you said earlier, what happens in China and in that region does not stay there. It affects all of us, no matter where we live. And you see China weaponizing space, the cyber attacks against U.S. interests, very dangerous trends there. Before leaving your post as Secretary of State, this regime in Beijing sanctioned you and President Trump, which is a high honor, I guess, because the reason they sanctioned you is for having a tough stance against their aggressive moves. And one of the things they were doing, Secretary, or are doing, sadly, is what you call genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority in China. And you were very involved in the religious freedom issue as Secretary of State. Tell us more about what China is doing with the Uyghurs and with religious minorities, including Christians in general, in that country.
There are 1 million+ people held in internment camps inside of Western China. There are women who are being forced to abort babies. There's forced sterilizations taking place. I could go on about the horrors, but it's enough to say that the whole world says we'll never let this happen again, right? What happened in the 1930s in Europe, it is not dissimilar in the horrors that are being inflicted on these Muslim populations in Western China today. There are many tools we have to respond to this. The current administration has acknowledged that genocide is both happened and is ongoing. I praise them for that. Now's the time to unite the entire world, the Christian world, the Muslim world, the Jewish world, to acknowledge that we're not going to let this happen to these people in Western China.
Obviously, the massive debt that China holds over our heads as well. But as you said, this is, people I think tend to forget, Secretary, this is an officially atheist regime. So any people of faith, of any faith, are a direct threat to the regime. Can you tell us a little bit more about the origins of COVID and more, even more importantly, perhaps, the cover-up of sorts by the Chinese government?
So there's this big debate about whether it came from the lab or not. I think it's abundantly clear that it came from the laboratory in Wuhan. It's called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They were working on viruses of this nature. The military was in there. They were doing this research that amped up these viruses. It was almost certainly at least an accidental escape from that laboratory. But I can't prove that out today because the Chinese Communist Party denied us the capacity to really know what happened. They shut out our CDC. They shut out our HHS. They disappeared journalists, they disappeared doctors, all the things that one would do if you had something to fear from the world knowing that you created a virus, amped it up in your laboratory, and then weren't capable of securing it. But whether it came from the lab or someplace else, we know this much. The cover-up is of the nature of an incredible crime. Right? We now have millions of people who have died, billions of dollars in lost wealth as a result of the Chinese Communist Party decision in the moment. In the fall of 2019, when they knew they had sick people, and at least by January, end of December of 19, beginning of January 20, they knew precisely what they had on their hands. And their choice, rather than come clean and help the world resolve this issue, they said, no, we're going to lock down Hubei province. We're going to lock down Wuhan, but we're going to put you all on airplanes around the world and make sure that at the very least this virus escapes. You can talk about intent, but at the very least, a lawyer would call it reckless negligence in allowing these people to travel when they knew they were infecting the whole world. This is something that if you killed 3 million people with a missile system, with a nuclear weapon, with some other instrument of power, they did it with this virus that they allowed to leave the country, and the West must hold them accountable for this. This is a tragedy that will impact the world for decades to come, and they've not even done so much, Eric, as close that lab down yet. They're still doing viral research in that laboratory. This is really dangerous.
Yeah, it's brazen. And I think you said the word, Secretary, accountability, for the West to hold the regime accountable across on a number of levels, COVID, but of course, the military buildup, the cyber and economic warfare, a host of threats posed by the Chinese regime. You crafted or helped craft with the Trump administration a very tough China policy, holding them accountable. What posture should the U.S. and the West take now?
We had begun to get this right. For 50 years, we flipped the policy on its head. For 50 years, we had appeased the Chinese Communist Party. We confronted them. But there's an awful lot of work to do. There are deep economic connections. That's the place to start. We began it in the most important space in telecommunications and national security things. Companies like Huawei, we built a global campaign to get this Chinese technology out of people's systems, out of the West systems. We made enormous progress in that. We're starting to take down TikTok that presents a real threat to our kids here in America. The Chinese are gathering data from American children. This is This is nutty that we allow this to continue to go on. But the tools, the sanctions tools, the economic tools, the building of coalitions, making sure that we're prepared to defend our assets and resources around the world as well with a counter cyber effort and a counter space effort. All of those things are underway. We need to make sure we resource them correctly and make it a real priority and make clear to the Chinese Communist Party that we're going to do this, that we're going to confront this. Last thing I'd say about this, Eric, we got to get it right at home. The Chinese Communist Party, you talked about the meeting in Anchorage with Secretary Blinken. They talked about Black Lives Matter. They talked about the riots in American cities. They believe America is in decline. I don't believe that for a second. But if we allow it to be so, if we're not prepared to defend our value set, our founding ideas, our freedoms here at home, if we get those wrong, the Chinese will drive a truck through that, and it will make our external efforts to confront them even more complicated and difficult.
Secretary, thank you so much for the work you're doing on this issue, for being on top of it. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Secretary.
Thank you.
We're joined now by Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington, D.C. Dean, great to have you with us. When it comes to China, you are a foremost expert on that military buildup. How strong is China militarily right now, and why the buildup? Not only conventional weapons, but their nuclear arsenal as well. What are they getting at here?
So first, some of the statistics. China, of course, is a nation of 1.4 billion people. Its military is correspondingly large. It's almost 2 million. To give you a sense, the U.S. military in total is about 1 million troops. They now have one of the world's largest air forces, one of the world's largest navies. They've always had some of the world's largest ground forces. We see them deploying space weapons, and anyone who has been on the internet knows that Chinese cyber hacking is a fact of life. Why are they doing this? A variety of reasons. Part of it is they do have the second largest economy in the world. And if you think of militaries as an insurance policy, the nicer the house you have, the nicer the car, the more insurance you need. But also part of it is to intimidate the neighbors. China has territorial disputes with almost every neighbor on its periphery, maritime, land. So we have seen the Chinese send troops across the border into India, a nuclear-armed neighbor. If you go on YouTube, you can see video of Chinese ships literally running over Vietnamese fishing boats that the Chinese accuse of fishing in Chinese waters. The Chinese have built islands hundreds of miles away from their coast in the South China Sea. And they have, of course, the issue of Taiwan, which they claim is a renegade province. And then they have disputes also with the Japanese. So what we have seen is a military modernization program. They have 2 stealth fighter programs. They are building modern destroyers, aircraft carriers, submarines, as I said earlier, space weapons. So it's a wide variety of systems. And we have detected fields of nuclear missile silos.
I wanted to ask you about that, Dean. The nuclear missile silos, China building up that arsenal. I think they've more than doubled their arsenal in the past 15 years or so alone. Doesn't seem like there are noble intentions with that program.
It's a very puzzling program. The Chinese exploded their first nuclear weapon in 1964. In the intervening 50-plus years, they've really only built a handful, maybe 20 ICBMs that could reach the United States. They have more nuclear weapons that can reach Russia, but of course Russia's closer. All of a sudden, they are building nuclear missile silos, and we think that those missiles will carry MIRVs, multiple independent warheads. We know that they are building submarine-launched ballistic missiles and a fleet of submarines to carry them. They are even talking about building nuclear-armed bombers. To give you an idea of how extraordinary that is, the Soviet Union built only a handful of those. They never really developed an air-breathing, airplane-based nuclear leg of their forces. The Chinese are talking about building a brand new bomber capable of launching air-launched cruise missiles.
So this is a rapidly modernizing military, conventional and non-conventional weapons of mass destruction program. It seems like the clear objective here is to not only catch up to the U.S., but to surpass the U.S. I wanted to ask you about 2 things you mentioned. Number one, the cyber hacking, which has become a serious problem, that Microsoft Exchange server that China recently hacked, and the weaponization of space. Could you take both of those, the hacking and the space program of China, which is alarming.
So, to the Chinese, these are actually flip sides of the same coin. Space for the Chinese matters not because there are things in orbit, but because it's how you gather information and how you transmit information. So it's all about information. The Chinese military says, we want to be prepared to fight and win informationized wars, because to their mind, that is the shape of future warfare. So the People's Liberation Army, which is a party army, it is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. It's perfectly natural for that military to do whatever is necessary to keep the party in power. If that means hacking Coca-Cola or Microsoft, they'll hack Microsoft and Coca-Cola. If it means keeping a watch on the Chinese population, they'll do that. In space, we've watched the Chinese develop a variety of anti-satellite weapons, as well as cyber weapons, to basically try and disrupt that information flow, whether it's hard kill, actually destroying satellites, or what's sometimes termed soft kill, jamming the satellite, infecting it with a computer virus, or, for example, shooting lasers and things, not like Star Wars, but to blind the sensors. So the satellite is still physically there, it hasn't blown up, but it can't operate anymore.
Last question, Dean. Can you talk about how that communist regime is getting its hooks, I guess you would say, into the Western Hemisphere as well? And I guess the most important question, okay, we've got a relatively new administration here in the U.S. What can be done about it? What can be done to counter this rising threat posed by Beijing?
China is trying to get its hooks into the West and the world in every possible domain. When Deputy Secretary of State Sherman went to China, and they gave her 2 lists of things you have to do, you America have to do, if you want better relations.
Yeah, I mean, they browbeat American officials in those meetings.
Absolutely. They clearly feel that they're in the dominant position. But if you take a look at their demands, it's fascinating. It's not just, hey, we want you to back off your military deployments in the Western Pacific. They said, you have to allow Confucius Institutes into your universities. You have to allow Chinese state-run media onto your networks. Why? Because that's influence. That is shaping the information domain. We want to be able to tell your audience how to think about us, how to teach about us, how to deal with us. It's a very different challenge. It is comprehensive, it is holistic, and it's one that I'm not sure that this administration has quite gotten its head or arms around.
Yeah, it's been a sea change from the previous administration to this administration in terms of dealing with China and the messaging in the face of this growing threat. Let's hope they get on the ball with it because, Dean, as you just laid out, this is a serious and growing threat. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Dean.
People are afraid to be interviewed on camera because they know the Chinese surveillance system covers everything. I choose not to be on the camera because I know the Chinese facial recognition system, surveillance system is so good that they can pick me out in 1.3 billion people in 7 minutes. It's like the Lord of the Rings. The eye sees it all. Chinese government is very much against all forms of religion, period, not just Christianity. Because they want communism to be the only religion that people would have. Communist government have full intention to control people's mind. And they know that religions are very formidable enemy to their endeavor. Chinese Communist Party and its government tries very hard to stop any kind of formal religious worship that's outside of their approval. I know a pastor, his very large underground church, house church. They were attracting the attention of the government, and so government's trying to use different tactics to shutting down and to close down his church. So the first that they used was just to turn off the water and electricity on his floor. And then the government official came and required him or asked him to install surveillance camera so that the government would keep tab on what's going on in the church. The pastor refused. So a few weeks later, some mobsters shows up in front of the church and intimidate all the congregation members that try to go into the church. And then the next thing you know, the landlord comes to them and say, we have to terminate the lease, even though they have a 10-year lease and they're only in year 2 or 3. And then the government just came in and just took away everything. Their Bibles, their pews, and disbanded the church. But the Chinese Christians are very creative. They will disperse and go to some other places once they got found out. My prayer is that going forward, these zealous, dedicated Christian pastors bring the gospel to the local communities and really changing the culture of whole China.
And we are joined now by Bob Fu, founder of China Aid. Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us a bit about your personal journey. I think it's key that you do have firsthand experience with this. You were a follower of the communist ideology. You became a Christian. You were exiled to Hong Kong. You're here in the States now. An incredible journey. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. 32 years ago, so I was in Tiananmen Square. We were fighting just for the corruption within the Communist Party. We were not really fighting with the Communist Party. We still thought, as one of the students' leaders, basically to reform the Communist Party for a better governance. But today, really, the regime of the Communist Party is committing genocide and a crime against humanity, where at least 1 to 3 million, according to the Pentagon, in West China, Xinjiang, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and even Han Chinese, Muslims, Christians alike, are being in the concentration camp in 21st century. I mean, we are talking about, a government that has jailed more people of faith than the rest of the world combined. And yet our, Western kind of money-lusting, non-principled, these greedy corporations are continuing to treat this as business as usual. Unfortunately, today, the Chinese Communist Party has, more control on what Americans can see, what we can read, what we can watch, what we can do than any regime has ever done in the history of our country. So these are not only a simple kind of a governmental appeasement policy, but really the corporate Americans, are all guilty of being enabler of this genocide regime. They're doing not only in general public in China doing business, they are making our Americans investment, our mutual funds has been investing heavily into Xinjiang, West China, where the regime's genocide is being committed right now. And yet they said business is business.
China is an emerging global superpower wielding all this influence around the world increasingly, and yet they have not only rampant persecution going on, but also this social credit system where the conversation, for instance, that you and I are having right now would leave us in a very bad spot, to say the least, in China under that social credit system. Tell us a bit more about what that is and why we here in the West should be so concerned about it.
Yes, Eric, I'm glad you asked this question. So the Chinese regime already installed over 2.5 billion, face recognition cameras already from your bedroom to your the street traffic lights everywhere. Every Chinese now is being followed with at least 2 face recognition cameras on their life. So the social credit system is basically a digitalized dictatorship through which the Chinese Communist Party can exercise its authoritarianism. Wherever you go, if you are a Christian, if you were put on under house arrest, or if you are found committing a house church worship, even in your home, you will be deducted, put on the blacklist.
Just so people understand, say you are a follower of Jesus. It's found that you are a Christian. Maybe under this social credit system, you can no longer get a home loan. You can't get a job. You're not allowed to buy a plane ticket. They will punish you for your beliefs. If you don't have the correct, quote unquote, politically correct beliefs, the Chinese regime will punish you, and the goal is to make your life unbearable.
Yeah, one of my friends, in Beijing, who's an economist. He is a Christian, and one day he went to the Beijing subway and he could not recharge his subway ticket until he went to the police in the subway, and the police honestly telling him, "Have you done anything offensive in your to your local police? And fix that. You are on that list. You can't recharge your ticket."
It's chilling, Bob. Right now in the West, this is a cautionary tale of sorts, because right here in the West, we're seeing people getting canceled for their beliefs, losing their jobs, getting locked out of social media because they don't have, quote unquote, the politically correct beliefs. It seems like what China is doing right now, sadly, could be a template for what's to come right here in the West. Are you concerned about that?
I'm very, very deeply concerned about the direction, the cancel culture, the elevation of communism, socialism, propaganda in this country, of course, after years of brainwash of our younger generation. It's just so scary. To see we have to exercise self-censorship. With the big tech companies would not tolerate freedom of speech.
Yeah, it's so disturbing, Bob, to hear you lay it out. U.S. companies are basically doing the bidding of the communist regime in China. It all comes down to the almighty dollar. Pretty sad fact. On an encouraging note, you are in the trenches talking to Chinese believers every day, quite literally. It's what you do at China Aid. Give us a sense of where the church in China is going. Yes, the persecution is getting worse, but man, Jesus is moving in that country. Tell us a bit more about that as we close.
I have heard and seen those courageous brothers and sisters, the testimony. As at China Aid, we called, expose, encourage, and equip. So to hear them saying, no, we will not bend our faith for the sake of survival. And they told me, to one sister whose husband was tortured for several years in prison for legal defense work, she said, we do not fear persecution, but we fear we lose the presence of God. And, one brother who was being detained for share the gospel in the marketplace, even in the middle of the pandemic, he and his mother even went to the marketplace. He was sentenced to several times administrative detention. Every time after he was released, he said, "Hallelujah, the Lord gave me another chance to share the gospel in my prison cell. And all the prisoners in my prison have heard the gospel. Many have come to Christ." So these are the testimonies are very real. Every day I heard about this. So this is what's happening in China. So despite of the persecution, God is still moving. The Holy Spirit has never stopped.
No, you cannot stop the gospel. Believers there are light in the darkness, Bob. And just to remind people again, this is a nation which is potentially the next superpower, global superpower that American companies are lining up to do business with. And this is what's happening, if you're a Christian, to your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. Hey, Bob, keep up the great work. We are so thankful for what you are doing, being a light and getting the word out. God bless you. Keep it up, Bob. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Eric, for having me.
And we are joined here at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. by author and activist Johnnie Moore. Johnnie, it's great to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
And what a topic you know very intimately, the Chinese regime and their suppression of any dissent. In 2017, you and a colleague co-wrote an open letter to Chairman Xi and encouraging him, imploring him to stop the persecution of Christians and religious minorities. Johnnie, fast forward to 2021, the Chinese regime sanctioned you. Why were they so upset with you and what you're trying to do?
Well, look, the Chinese government knows that we know that they're weaker than that we think that they are. And here's the fact. The Chinese Communist Party has been on a dead-end road for a long period of time now. They're dragging along with them the Chinese citizens. And at the heart of this attack on freedom is the human dignity of hundreds of millions of Chinese people. So yeah, I mean, there are Americans like me that are sanctioned because I dared raise my voice. But we're no victims. The victims are the hundreds of millions of Christians and others in the country that the Chinese Communist Party either wants to shut up or forced to shut up.
Yeah, I love your response to the sanctions. You said that basically this is a badge of honor to be sanctioned by you, the regime in Beijing. What do these sanctions entail? Is it more symbolic on their part?
Look, I mean, if the Communist Party of China thinks that I'm a threat enough to sanction, then they're in a lot more trouble than we think that they are. Yeah. But basically, I can't travel to China. Yeah. And you know, that makes me sad, Eric, because I've been to China. I love the Chinese people. I love the Chinese history and Chinese culture. I would love to go to China, but that's what I can't do now. Yeah. But what they're not going to do is they're not going to shut me up, and they're not going to shut up millions and millions of people like me around the world that are saying, look, we love China. We're happy to have a competition between China and the United States. Let's make the world better together. But if the Chinese Communist Party is going to shut down churches, imprison millions of Muslims, try to wipe out Tibetan history, take over Hong Kong, threaten to take over Taiwan, steal the intellectual property of the United States of America, and try to make the world in its communist Marxist image, then we're just not going to settle for it. My kids are not going to grow up in China's world.
And you were very vocal and forthright about these issues, Johnnie, as a commissioner on the International Commission on Religious Freedom under the previous administration here in D.C. And you had a firsthand view in that role as commissioner to what China is doing to its Christian minority. The persecuted Christians in China, major issue, of course. What is the state of the church in China right now?
Well, the church is doing just fine. The Christianity has 2,000 years of history of only growing when tyrants threaten to suppress it. The church is going to be fine. There is no atheist communist leader in the world that can limit the growth of the church. Now, what they're trying to do is they're trying to intimidate the church. So in the last 18 months and 24 months, the Chinese Communist Party has shut down every significant large church in the country. They have arbitrarily detained, confiscated the property, bulldozed, and in some cases disappeared and even killed pastors. They've taken down thousands of crosses. When ISIS was at its height in Iraq and Syria, and the world was watching in horror as people were beheaded and all these terrible things were happening, in that 1 year, in one state in China, the Communist Party removed over 1,000 crosses from churches. So they think they're wiping out Christianity. But the actual fact is there are now more Christians in China than there are members of the Communist Party.
And this is an exciting development. You can't stop the gospel at the end of the day. Tell us about Chairman Xi, who we mentioned earlier. You were sanctioned under his regime, but this is someone who seems to have a particular animus towards Christians. It seems like the persecution is escalating in China in recent years under his stewardship, and he's garnering more and more power.
Yeah, you know, we're sitting here in Washington, D.C., and there aren't a lot of things that Democrats and Republicans agree upon in this city. Here's one thing they agree upon, that this regime in China is going in a very, very dangerous direction. That the President Xi, who's leading China, is having what I call a relapse to the Cultural Revolution. Now, the prosperity of China of the last generation or so didn't come because of the values of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Yeah. The economic progress, the global renown, all of these defining characteristics. They came because of the inculcation of Western ideas into a communist framework. Well, what President Xi is trying to do is he's trying to take China back to the Cultural Revolution. The last time this happened, China killed 50 million of its own citizens. It tried to wipe out any dissent whatsoever. And what we're seeing is the cult of personality, the suppression of the economy. Wall Street is starting to realize it's a foolhardy deal to try to make money with China, the suppression of religious freedom, of human rights. He has one goal, that is to control the Chinese people and along the way to control the rest of the world. And the only thing standing in the way of it is if people in this city can put down their swords and shields and unite arm in arm and say that freedom will be handed off to the next generation. And we can make a wonderful planet together with the country of China, but China is going to have to play by the rules.
Talk about China as the surveillance state and intruding on its citizens' lives. And could that eventually, those kind of tactics, impact us here in the West?
Hey, look, this is the difference. President Xi has something that Mao never had: advanced modern technology. And Chinese citizen living in the western part of the country can't walk across a single block without their every move, the images of their eyes, facial recognition software tagging them hundreds of times. And so what President Xi is attempting to do is to take the best of Western technology and to create a 21st century authoritarian state, a overtly atheistic state bent upon not only suppressing all dissent, but any evidence of God whatsoever. I mean, Xi is not only trying to be the president of China, he's trying to be the God of China, and then along the way to make the rest of the world in his image.
This is a really horrific situation where China, in the eyes of the world, is committing, in the words of the former Secretary of State, genocide against one of its religious minorities.
But it's also not new. You know, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, took a courageous action. He stood in front of the United States of America and the entire world and said, China, its Communist Party, is guilty of genocide. But even before China was committing genocide against the Uyghurs, it had committed cultural genocide against the Tibetans. It had shut down thousands and thousands of other religious communities, including our own Christian community. It had even taken indigenous practices like the Falun Gong, which is a meditation practice, and wiped out the community. In fact, engaged in forced organ harvesting, where someone will travel to China and they'll arrive in China to get an organ, and the Chinese Communist Party has authorized killing an individual from a minority community to take their organ, to sell that organ to a medical tourist. I mean, these are horrific, horrific actions that should not be taking place in the 21st century. And frankly, we're at a crossroads as a world. We're at a crossroads. And the crossroads is we're going to hand our future generations to the way of the Chinese Communist Party or to the freedom and prosperity we've inherited from previous generations. And so this is a battle for all of us to do. But look, it's not against the Chinese people.
Right.
You know, in fact, people say that the communists in China and President Xi fear the United States of America. They don't fear the United States of America first. They fear their own people first. This is why they shut down their places of worship. This is why they hack into their cell phones. This is why they spy on every aspect of their lives. This is why they make people disappear. This is why a simple village pastor who dares to say that he believes in a power greater than government, that he has faith in God, a simple village pastor is such a threat to the powerful communists in Beijing that they will bulldoze his church after removing his cross and make him disappear for his children to be orphans and his wife to be a widow. And if she dare says anything, they will give her the same treatment too.
You've laid out a litany of things that the Chinese regime, destructive behaviors that they're engaging in. What ultimately can be done to counter this threat here in the U.S.?
Well, look, our elected officials need to do their job, and thankfully they are. Democrats and Republicans are standing together on these issues. President Biden is taking executive orders passed by President Trump, signed by President Trump, not revoking them, but expanding them in order to target the illicit activity of China's communists. Our government have to do their job. They have to secure our supply chain. They have to handle our infrastructure challenges. They have to make sure our technology is beyond vulnerability. All of these things have to happen. But those things will only happen if the American people demand that this is a priority issue for them. And so all of us have a part to play. But as Christians, we have a special part to play, because every suffering Christian in this enormous country is a brother and sister of ours in Christ. And every person who isn't a Christian who is suffering, the Bible says to us, they're also made in the image of God. And this freedom is not something that President Xi has the authority to take away. It is given to them by God. And so every day we need to pray for China. We need to raise our voices to keep pressure on our politicians. And we need to pray that within the Communist Party itself, within China itself, that other leaders decide they don't want this path for their own children. Because imagine what the United States and China can do together.
It would be an amazing thing. Reverend Johnnie Moore, thank you so much for keeping an eye on this. We really appreciate it. Keep up the great work.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Here in China, there is such darkness. But even in the midst of this darkness, we are experiencing God's victory. I became a believer 10 years ago. I heard about Christ when I was on a business trip. After that, my entire family came to Christ. But we are not free to share our faith with others. If you are spreading the gospel, Chinese government treat you as a criminal. They want to control the number of Christians. They want to control what God is doing. I hear from time to time of brothers and sisters being persecuted and arrested. Last week, a good friend of mine was taken by the Chinese police. He was questioned and then beaten so bad that he almost died. All because of spreading the gospel. In the city, everywhere you look, there are apartments. Since we can't meet in public, our ministry takes place in the buildings we live in. In the evenings, brothers and sisters in Christ gather together in homes. This is our church.
这个属于是我们最知心的朋友。主啊，神啊，在这所幸的日子，你聚集了你的孩子。她无论在她帐篷那边做什么事，都求你给她开启吧。主，我们把以下的事情。
If you ask people on the street, most have never heard of Christ or read the Bible. No one in their family is a believer. The dangers here are driven by darkness, and that darkness can be quite fearful, especially when I think of my family. But God never fears, and He will overcome. So I want to go and share, despite being at risk. I minister to the neighbors that live next door or upstairs. I visit them often. I listen and I share in their life. When I get the chance, I tell the story of Jesus Christ and we pray. And the Holy Spirit works. Every week, we see new people come to Christ. Only 2 weeks ago, an amazing thing happened. We discovered there was another home church meeting at the top of this very same building. In our own building, God had brought up another fellowship. That really humbled us. In the midst of all the darkness, all the persecution, the Holy Spirit is moving. He continues to prepare the hearts of people in China. Every day, I have the opportunity to share the love of Jesus Christ. even if it means I could go to prison. For who can have victory over God? Nobody, no matter what country.
We're joined now by best-selling author and China expert Gordon Chang. Gordon, welcome. You know, one of the themes of this program is that China is on the rise, but you wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China. You say there is dents in the armor of the Red Dragon. Tell us about that.
Well, right now there are critical vulnerabilities. So, for instance, China can't feed itself. It had a disastrous 2020. This year is worse, and it's slated to become even less self-sufficient in food. We're also seeing, for instance, the environment. Despite the recent flooding, the big issue is scarcity of water. That's a problem that plagues China year in, year out. We have a people who are somewhat restive. They really can't do very much because they face an extremely coercive political system, but we know that there is discontent. And demography. China is slated to have the biggest demographic collapse in history in the absence of war or disease this century. These are problems which are difficult. Now, I'm sure Beijing could handle them if there were only one or two, but the problem for China right now is that the regime faces them all at once.
Speaking of the buildup in China, the military buildup, we've had reports recently, Gordon, that China is developing more missile silos in different provinces. They've more than doubled their nuclear arsenal in the past 15 years or so. What's the goal here for the regime? Why all of the military buildup? You would think they have an eye on the United States, of course, and supplanting the U.S., but also Taiwan is sitting there, and China would love to bring Taiwan back into the fold.
Yeah. What you have right now, China had maybe a policy of minimal deterrence. Really what it wanted to do was just to deter other countries from using their nukes against China. With this rapid buildup, which has become evident over the last 6 weeks, it's clear that they've moved from that to war-fighting capability. In other words, they want to threaten other countries with nukes so they won't come to the aid of Taiwan, for instance. And just a couple weeks ago, we had China threaten Japan with nuclear annihilation if they were to help Taiwan. And this was explicit. So really what they're trying to do is intimidate the rest of the world with this rapid buildup in their arsenal.
Here in the West, how is China expanding its influence inside America and at America's doorstep?
Well, last year, China was inciting violence on American streets. That goes beyond just mere subversion. That's an act of war. And we have seen China engage in other dangerous activity. In the region, it wants influence, so it's propping up the Cuban regime. It's propping up the one in Venezuela. It has ties around Latin America. And in the Bahamas, it is building 2 huge ports, which are economically unjustifiable. I suspect that they're going to be turned into military bases in the not too distant future when they can't pay Beijing back. But, you know, in general, Eric, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been promoting this notion of Tianxia, that Chinese rulers have a mandate of heaven over Tianxia, or all under heaven. In other words, they're propagating the notion that they're the only legitimate rulers in the world, which means that the United States, in their view, should just be a colony. So this is China's mindset right now. And by the way, they don't confine their ambitions to planet Earth because since 2018, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars should be sovereign Chinese territory.
He seems to really be consolidating power, or seems to be one of the most powerful Chinese premiers in decades.
Well, he reveres Mao Zedong. He is not able to make China a Maoist state, but he's pushing as fast as he can. And so therefore we see him engaging in all sorts of activity, which a lot of Westerners find perplexing, but he demands control. So Xi Jinping is an ambitious ruler. He is willing, I think, to take no prisoners. You know, he does look powerful right now, but because he's taken power from everybody else, he's also means that there's nobody else has accountability, only him, which means if something goes wrong, he knows he's going to be blamed. The other thing that he's done since he's taken over, since the end of 2012, is he's raised the cost of losing political struggles. So that means he knows that if he makes a mistake, he could lose everything. He could lose everything, which means he has a very low threshold of risk.
You know, we see Xi and China forging relationships with the likes of Russia and Iran, American adversaries. We see China with cyber hacking against U.S. interests, sensitive government agencies. President Trump took a very strong line against China. What do you think of how the U.S. is dealing with this threat thus far under the Biden administration? Could we be doing more?
We have to be doing more. So, for instance, about 3 weeks ago, the Biden administration said that the hack on Microsoft Exchange was essentially run by China's Ministry of State Security, and that ransomware hackers in China are actually working hand in hand with the Chinese central government, which means that it's responsible for this criminal activity. But the Biden administration has imposed no costs on China after making that attribution. And today they explained the reason why, and that is American allies won't go along with imposing those costs. So this is really the downside of having allies. Because, Biden talks about, we need to have allies in our dealings with China. This America First idea is really horrible because it isolated America, is what Biden says. Well, the downside of it is you have the lowest common denominator solutions, and sometimes no solutions at all, because we're not doing anything about all of these attributions that the Biden administration itself made.
And I think what you're saying, Gordon, is these allies are willing to overlook the bad behavior of the Chinese regime in order to do business with China. I guess at the end of the day, it affects their bottom line if they take a tough stance on China. And look, China's also got this so-called social credit system at home, which is Orwellian, something out of 1984, monitoring its citizens. And yet we have American companies continuing to gladly do business with Beijing.
Yeah, and this is really totalitarian. People say, China's authoritarian. No, it's no longer authoritarian. It may not be full-on totalitarian, but Xi Jinping is driving it there. And he's driving it there with things like the social credit system, which, by the way, is collecting information not only in China, but also elsewhere around the world and feeding it back into China's social credit system. China is engaged in all sorts of human rights violations, but it gets worse than that, because we are seeing with its Turkic minorities, this is just mass detentions and concentration camps. There's institutionalized rape.
And you're talking about the Uyghurs, that Muslim minority in the Xinjiang province.
It is Uyghurs, it's Kazakhs, and other Turkic minorities. And this is institutionalized rape, institutionalized slavery, probably forced organ harvesting. We see children being put in facilities that look like prisons, and there's genocide. What China is doing meets the definition of genocide in the Article 2 of the Genocide Convention of 1948.
You mentioned the crackdown on the Muslim minority, the Kazakhs, the Turkic minority inside China. We've also been talking on this program about the struggles of the Christian minority in China as well, which it's a minority now, but wow, the church there is growing. Can you talk about the threat that Christianity, any faith really, but Christianity in particular, poses to this atheistic regime in Beijing?
Yeah, it is any faith, because not only are they cracking down even harder on Christians, they're even going after Buddhists, which in the Chinese view is supposed to be a homegrown religion. Well, the Buddhists are also the target of Beijing. Christianity right now, very interesting, because in the house Protestant churches, there is just unbelievable zeal that the Communist Party no longer has. And we don't know how many people practice Protestantism in China, but it could very well be over 100 million. Wow. It's just spread like wildfire.
China is clearly on the march. As we see the chess pieces moving on the board, what is their next move? Where is this heading under Xi? And again, what should the response be from the world? Rather than this passivity that we've seen, what can the world do about this?
China is able to threaten us only with our consent, because we've been fueling China's military machine and its security apparatus and all the rest of it. So I believe that we shouldn't be trading with China. We shouldn't have investments with China. We shouldn't have technical cooperation agreements. We shouldn't be funding their biological weapons labs, as we have found out recently that, in fact, that's what we've been doing. I know this sounds drastic, but the point is that China can bring down the international system. It threatens all of us, and it can only do that with our money. So we shouldn't be supplying it.
Yeah, and the U.S. is obviously in massive debt to China as well. But I think our great hope, Gordon, as you mentioned, is the Chinese people, brilliant, proud people. We have a growing, the church is growing there. People of faith, of all faiths, are growing there. So we'll be keeping a close eye on it. We know you will be, Gordon. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Economically and militarily, China is clearly on the rise. And as the influence of China's communist government permeates the globe, any semblance of freedom of speech, even thought, is rapidly disappearing. For China's Christians, that means enduring severe persecution at the hands of an atheist regime. Yet, against all odds, the Chinese church is not just surviving, it's thriving. So, while the Red Dragon marches on, the unwavering faith of Chinese Christians continues to inspire hope, not only in China, but in the United States and throughout the world. Thanks for watching, and God bless.